This video is for chapter 4, which is entitled Families in Social Class. So this chapter begins off by discussing Donald J. Trump Jr. as an example of someone whose life, his trajectory, his experiences, the opportunities that have been afforded him, someone whose life has been heavily influenced by the social class of the family he was born into, as a way of introducing this idea that social class isn't something that we just experience and achieve as individuals, right? That social class is something that is experienced, through the families that we are born into, and then in the families that we might go on to construct ourselves. And from the beginning, Cohen introduces, these two kind of competing perspectives on class, that we can think about class as a ladder, or we can think about class, as categories. And he emphasizes that, depending on which view of social class you use and you utilize, kind of is going to influence how you might understand how class might operate in the lives and experiences of individual families. And so, this quote from page 119: both views show people in richer versus poorer stations, but the latter accentuates their status as individuals and their ability to move up and down. The boxes, on the other hand, highlight the shared positions of people in groups, and also the barriers between groups that make it difficult to climb around. So, Cohen is a big proponent of the boxes, the social class as groups kind of approach. And that's how he structures, the discussion of class in this chapter. I certainly, in a lot of introductory sociology courses, the latter approaches may be the more common one. Although I will primarily focus on the approach used by Cohen, I will at several points kind of go back. I will make a comparison to the latter approach, just kind of highlighting some ways in which they differ when we start talking about the US class system. But before we get to the discussion of the US class system, the first part of the chapter deals with theories of social class. And so once again, we're back kind of discussing the distinction between the consensus and the conflict perspectives. So, these perspectives were introduced to you all and discussed thoroughly in chapter 1. And now we are explicitly going to look at them through the lens of discussing social inequality, and specifically division of labor. And, so division of labor is basically how we divide up, the functions in society and the social process of determining, based on who does what work, what should be their level of rewards. The consensus, also called the functionalist perspective, the kind of traditional view of division of labor was voiced by two theorists, Davis and Moore. And so we'll talk a little bit about their theory as well as the critique of their theory. And then for the conflict view, kind of the primary theorist is Marx. And I'll talk a little bit about Marxist theory. And then we'll talk about just kind of some broad takeaways of the two consensus and conflict perspectives, just generally speaking. So Davis and Moore's explanation, and so they wrote this in 1945, and then they kind of tweaked it and put out a revised version in 1953. So just kind of keep this in mind, the mindset, and kind of the culture and the social context of, the United States during the 1940s and the 1950s. So, their argument is society must make sure that positions are filled, right? If there are positions in society, that we need to have people doing those positions. But some positions are more important than others. They're more essential, they're more central to a society's well being, to specific societal functions. And those important positions must be filled with those who are qualified. So whatever that might mean, right? Whether that's specific talents, whether that's specific skills, whether that's like specific educational backgrounds, qualified people have to fill these important positions. And then to motivate the qualified people to fill these positions, as opposed to maybe easier positions or positions that come with a more immediate, kind of reward or upside, these important positions have to be more heavily rewarded, right? And so, if you are thinking about Davis and Moore's explanation, it sounds very straightforward on its face, right? And you might be like, I don't see a problem here. What's the issue? Makes sense to me. Well, let's consider some critiques of it. And so, several people have critiqued the Davis and Moore. The critiques that I am going to kind of emphasize here are primarily the ones that come from uh, a theorist by the name of Tuman. So one kind of major issue that he has is, how do we know that positions? How do we know what positions are the most important? Because if we actually look at the difference in rewards between positions, that's not necessarily a measure of their relative worth to society. Like everyone says, teachers have a very important job, but yet teachers are certainly not the most highly paid position, especially given the level of education that it requires, when compared to other jobs that are significantly better paying, particularly some of those that exist like in the finance, industries. And if you think about like younger children, then the distinction becomes even more stark, right? Early childhood education, early childhood care providers, especially in a society now where in a lot of families, if they are two parent homes, there is a greater likelihood that both parents work than in previous generations. And then, of course, as we've discussed, there is a growing number of single parent households. So daycare providers have a very essential, very important job. Oftentimes those people who work those jobs, their pay is significantly lower than what one might would expect. So we can't necessarily look at compensation as an indication that a job is important based on how much we reward it. Another kind of major critique that Tuman offers has to do with, that point three, right? How do we know that it really is the most qualified people who get those important positions? This type of stratification should equal a meritocracy, but it doesn't. In reality, it may limit the discovery of talent. If people who are, born into upper class, upper middle class families, if they have access to more resources, then they might have the ability to access, education, or access, education at schools that have, a more distinguished name or pedigree than people who are just as smart, who are just as talented, but due to a lack of resources, aren't necessarily able to access those same opportunities. And so, that assumption, right, that important positions, the positions that are most important in society are well rewarded, that the people who hold these positions are definitely the most qualified. Tuman's point is that this is the it's just that, it's assumptions, and oftentimes those assumptions can be faulty. um which brings us to the next, or the opposing, I guess, view. Because if this was the consensus perspective, then let's now talk about kind of the primary theorist associated with the conflict perspective and his take on the division of labor. And so that would be Karl Marx, not a sociologist, but as I mentioned before, he is considered a forefather of sociology. And he felt that the engine of human history is class conflict, that there is this internal struggle between the haves and the have nots. And for him specifically, he saw this as breaking between two groups. The group that he calls the bourgeoisie, they are the owners of the means of production. So they own the factories, right? They own the businesses, they own the companies. And then the proletariat, they're the workers, and they work, right? They don't own the means of production. They basically have to trade their labor for wages. And and Marx thought that that in order for the owners to turn a profit and be profit driven, they don't necessarily pay their workers, they don't pay the proletariat significant money, enough money, what we now would call a living wage. And he thought that this was going to change, right? He was optimistic that that society was going to change. And specifically how he thought society was going to change was that he foresaw that that there would be this kind of massive class conflict, and that the working class would rise up and basically overthrow the kind of capitalist class. And when they did that, he said that capitalism would be replaced by what he defined as being a more advanced system. And so this is the part that oftentimes people who haven't studied Marx, haven't read Marx, this is the part that they often get incorrect. Because they immediately think, okay, well, Marxism, where the government sees, property and gives it out to people, and that's not quite what Marx's vision or Marx's discussion or description of communism was like. After the overthrow of capitalism, he did foresee a period of time where the government was going to own the means of production. So they basically were going to strip private property and make it government property. And he called this socialism, where the government owns the means of production. And he said that socialism would be in place for some, undetermined amount of time. But then he thought at some point, as people got so used to the idea of of not being individually driven by profit, learning to share, and living lives that it wasn't necessarily focused on working to earn wages, to buy commodities. He's like, once we move past that, he was like, we would enter this period that he then described as communism. And the key word there for him in his writing was that under communism, government would wither away, right? There would now be no more government. That was the main distinction between socialism and communism, according to Marx's vision. Now, of course, Marx's vision pretty much never came to fruition. And before I discuss why, let me just go ahead and address, those of you that might say, hey, I thought China tried communism, or I thought Cuba tried communism, or I thought North Korea tried communism. And what they did was more like they got to the second step, the socialism part, and instead of government withering away, instead government became strengthened, and a strong governmental bureaucratic class would form that often in a lot of those countries was corrupt, and authoritarian. So instead of socialism withering away into communism, instead what you had was socialism hardening into totalitarianism. So in short, the Marxist vision never happened anywhere. And even the countries that used, that stole the vernacular and called themselves communist countries, not Marx's version of communism. And if you think about why it didn't happen in other countries, there are a lot of factors. First of all, there's the factor, it's easy to talk about class conflict, maybe theoretically, but in people's families, um, but the actual kind of logistics and details of what would this type of class conflict, what would it involve, you're talking about bloody violent overthrow. And certainly one significant kind of factor that Marx overlooked is that as in developed societies, people aren't just capitalists and workers, and inconsequential others, they aren't just beggars. I mean, think about all the middlemen. You have merchants and you have professionals professionals like doctors, and you have teachers, and where would they fall in the class conflict? Where would their interests align? And although there may not be a lot of proletariat that have family members that are the bourgeoisie, the fact of the matter is, in a significant percentage of proletariat families, you do have some members of their family that at least moved out of kind of the true proletariat class into some of those kind of middle class groups, some of those kind of trades, and lower level professions. So that was the issue. It's worth noting that especially in a lot of Western European nations, and of course nations like America, instead of capitalism becoming increasingly unbearable the way that Marx thought it would, right? Because he's working at a time where workers had no protections, right? They were working for next to nothing. They did not have, health care. If they got injured or even died, while in the factory or on the factory floor, nobody cared about them. No one took care of their families. We were working, children as young as 4 and 5, to death. And Marx thought that was going to continue to get worse, that capitalism was going to continue to be that level of cruelty. But in a lot of countries, what actually happened, is instead of this laissez-faire capitalism, of course, we started to have more government intervention and regulation. We had the maximum hour workday. We had minimum wage laws. We had laws, prohibiting people to work, full time if under a certain age. We had laws passed related to worker safety and other types of benefits. So capitalism wound up not being as oppressive, and as Marx thought that it was on the path to be. And then especially in America, and it's worth noting that, the one country that Marx wasn't so confident about that kind of worker revolt was America, because of the role of race. He kind of was like, part of what's going to make class unity hard is, at America, especially at the time, that he was writing in the late 1800s, turn of the century, he was just like, in America, where you have this kind of glaring color line between whites and people of color, particularly African Americans, he was like, that's going to make it difficult to have class solidarity among workers as well. All right, so that is Marx's theory of social inequality. So if you're just kind of taking a step back and like, what are the kind of broad themes or, between differences between consensus and conflict, is, at the end of the day, consensus theorists just really believe that inequality is necessary and actually serves a beneficial function in society, while conflict theorists see inequality as basically being a result of economic exploitation. And so based on these different perspectives, obviously the role of social classes is going to differ. And so particularly for the conflict theorists, they emphasize the fact that classes are not natural phenomena, and they're defined by their relationship to each other. So you have a working class because you have a capitalist class. While consensus theorists really are just like, oh, classes are based largely on the resources that you do or don't have, and that this is a continuum. And they don't necessarily see the classes as existing, in direct opposition to one another. Another theorist, who is not maybe a true conflict theorist, but he is probably more along the conflict side than the consensus side, is Weber. And he was like, okay, he was interested in how do we talk about people who may not have an income and whose class position might change in the future. And so his concept of life chances, is meant to address people like that, like college students, for instance, or children, period. And so life chances is basically just the practical opportunity that you have to achieve desired material conditions like employment, higher education, home ownership, small business ownership. And for Weber, it's worth noting that life chances isn't just the abstract freedom, right? It's not just a slogan. It's not just saying, like, hey, anybody can get ahead in America, or like, hey, you can grow up to be anything you want to be. No, he was really interested in like the practical ability that people have to do those things, right? So if we say that, you can grow up to be anything that you want to be in America, like, do we provide all people the necessary resources to make that happen? And if we don't, then the conclusion is that people have kind of different life chances in regards to achieving this success. Cohen really likes to use this concept of life chances to help explain how social class works within families, because the job, the income of a parent is going to affect the life chances of their spouse and their children. It's going to affect like what types of opportunities are they able to afford and offer them. Um, and so in this way, of course, life chances is related to social class position. Similarly, social capital is another important concept that comes up when we're theorizing about class position, because so far I've been talking about like very tangible, like concrete resources, income, homes, businesses, right? But social capital, the access to resources one has by virtue of relationships and connections within a social network. The idea is not what you know but who you know. It also speaks to social classes, because although everyone has some social capital, in a society that is distinguished by upper, middle, and lower social classes, the social capital that is enjoyed by people in the upper classes often counts for more and is more meaningful and is more beneficial than the social capital of people who are in the lower classes. You are introduced to a new sociologist in this chapter by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, who is French. But he developed this idea, right, that we grow up in, these contexts, in these spaces, and these spaces, they contain, information about how to get ahead within that space, how to interact within that space, how to fit in within that space, and that's called habitus. But in larger society, right, where we kind of prioritize and privilege, the experiences and the knowledge and the capital of people in the upper middle class and the upper class, obviously people who grow up in that habitus are going to have an advantage over people who don't grow up in that habitus, right? Because they're going to belong to that group. And so, they're going to grow up learning how to act in different situations and being taught skills in certain kinds of work. And those skills and that kind of work is going to be, that is held and esteemed by the upper classes. It's not that being in the lower class, you also don't learn how to act in different situations, and you don't also obtain skills related to certain kinds of work, but you're kind of obtaining skills and obtaining knowledge that really is only pertinent and really is only beneficial in that lower class. So this isn't going to help people get ahead. This isn't going to help people, children who grow up in that class. It's not going to be as beneficial to them if they're trying to rise up in class position. And so he ends this discussion of the theories of social class, and tries to tie it all together by comparing two extended family groups. The first is a wealthy family, the Winstons, and the second is a working class family. The story of Evie, who he mentions, comes from, a book that was written by another sociologist, Catherine Newman, a book that she did on fast food workers, No Shame in My Game. So with the Winstons, what he's really trying to emphasize is it's not just that the three girls that were part of the Winston family, it's not just that they grew up in this upper class, upper middle class home, and were able to enjoy, all of the resources that go along with that, but it's that
they were then able to kind of network and integrate themselves, in social groups largely comprised of people who look like them. Look at where they all three went to school: Yale University, Skidmore College, Brown University, right? So we have Ivy Leagues, and one of the Seven Sisters, which is not an Ivy, but is a private college that just has a very long and storied history. So, think about the types of people that they probably met and befriended and networked with when they were in those types of spaces. And then if you look at then who two of them went on to marry, they went on to marry people that also went to, really nice, colleges and universities, and have, these upper middle class jobs. One married an attorney, and because her job is listed as a volunteer, we can assume he makes sufficient amount of money for her to not work. And the other one married a bank executive. And those gentlemen, as Cohen discussed, also came from families, with a similar background. And so, consider that quote from page 125. Um, Showing their interconnections is important for understanding that this class is not just people with very high salaries and professional jobs, but a group of connected families full of people with high salaries and professional jobs. So substantial wealth passes from generation to generation, along with the lifestyle, education, and social connections of their extended networks, enjoyed in their big houses and summer homes and private schools for their children. When they marry, they usually marry endogamously, that is, within their group. Although not formally named like the aristocracies of old Europe, this class still uses family to forge a cohesive social group. And so, right, in America, we like to pride ourselves on the fact that we don't have like landed title gentry. We don't have lords and ladies, and we don't have dukes and duchesses. But certainly, we do have a class of people that, even if it's not 100% closed, meaning, it's not that there's no way that you could enter into that group, it is very difficult because they take steps to close it off, to too many interlopers. Right. They send their children to private schools or fancy public schools, so they can largely be around children like themselves. When they get older, they go to colleges largely attended people like themselves. As the book notes, they largely marry people like themselves. So this keeps both their capital as well as their social capital kind of locked within the group. And then we get the story of Evie's family, and it's larger. Cohen emphasizes the fact that some of her children are married, some aren't married. They're all working. All of the ones who are working are working jobs that are at best considered to be working poor to working class jobs. They live in a neighborhood largely surrounded by similar people. If you take what we know about, the relationship between where you live and where you go to school, all of the grandchildren, that she has, you can imagine they're largely going to school with other young people that share their economic station. And so this is important because, as he notes in his figure 4.3, which, unlike figure 4.2, which actually is mapping out the relationships that exist within the Winston family, this is just theoretical figure 4.3, but it's making the point that most of the people that are working class and working poor, the connections they have are only to people within the same class, and they pretty much marry other people of that class. In Evie's family, there was only example of like one or two that married outside of their class, or what Cohen is describing here is across the tracks. So, if you think about the classes in just in terms of like two broad, groups, working class, working poor, poor, upper middle, upper class, the spaces, they inhabit separate distinct social spaces, and they don't overlap, and they certainly don't overlap and share spaces equals in that many contexts, which means the barriers that exist between them are, as Cohen notes, pretty formidable. And so in this way, what happens is, this is how social class networks can help us understand better the concept of class identity, the awareness of and the sense of belonging to a specific social class. When you are largely surrounded and interacting with people who share your kind of economic and social resources. What might happen is that distinctive ways of life and patterns of interaction form that you become used to, right? The word that I used before, habitus. And so, what that means is that's what you get used to, right? You develop a class identity. You think of yourself as I am middle class, I am upper class, I am working class, I am lower class. And so class identity, Cohen notes, is a more durable measure than fluctuating income because people are raised and socialized according to their family's class perspectives. Is the one that they're always going to be most comfortable with. Um, and it's going to be the one that, aligns with their identity. Um, and they can use that knowledge of being part of that social class so that even if they have kind of what he terms short-term unevenness in circumstances, because they know the rules, because they know the habits, because they know the culture of the class that they were raised in, the social capital allows them to kind of give off the impression that they are part of that class if maybe even their economic resources aren't. So you take someone like me. My parents were at some time when I was a child, middle school, they made the transition slowly but surely from lower middle class to, very safely upper middle class. And I grew up in that context of, being raised, to not question whether or not I was going to go to college. The question was just which university. They bought me a car. I worked part time, but just because I have a shopping habit, and they gave me allowance, but it wasn't enough for me to be the dressiest girl in school. So I worked for part time, but it also meant that I quit jobs whenever they became inconvenient because it wasn't like I had to work. I was in these spaces. We took vacations, and we were definitely not upper class, but we were definitely not working class or lower. And so in my head, even when my own income, I've gone through, bouts of unemployment and a bad breakup that, left me kind of economically struggling for a couple of months. In my head, I was always part of that class group because that was my class identity. And I could always interact with other people in that class group and act as if I was part of that class group because I was socialized in that. And so, in this way, this also kind of becomes a privilege associated with being upper middle class. Because even when your economic resources aren't matching your class identity, certainly for a short limited time period, you can pretend like you are still part of this class because you have that social capital. So I've already been referring to the different classes. So this is the part where in the chapter where Cohen talks about the American class structure. And he talks about it in terms of like four broad groups: lower class, working class, middle class, and upper class. Because, especially, if you're not a sociologist and you're not like creating some elaborate classification based on specific, economic and educational resources, usually these are the terms that people would use to describe themselves. And as you can see, a lot of people, in America describe themselves as being middle class or working class. So I'm going to talk primarily using his categories. And a couple of categories, I am going to kind of point out, how the ladder system particularly the six class classification system, which is one of the more popular ones um, uh, that exist and is frequently taught in introductory sociology courses. I'll point out where there are some differences between the four group version that Cohen is using, and the six class group that you sometimes see when you're using the latter version. So for him, the upper class is the more appropriate label than the 1%, because it actually is more than 1% um, that can fall in this group that he calls the capitalist and corporate managerial class. He describes them as having an extremely high standard of living, and their economic and political influence is far beyond their numbers, right? So they are disproportionately represented in politics. They give a lot of money to politicians. Um, and of this group, some of them are even richer than the rest. And we'll talk about the super rich later in this lecture. But this just gives you a sense of, when we're talking about like the highest paid CEOs, who are we talking about? People like Tim Cook. It says apply, it should say Apple. 150 million. Walmart, Mark Lore, 237 million. Some of the Elon Musk from Tesla, 100 million. And some of these numbers have, obviously, I think this is from 2018, so some of these numbers have definitely fluctuated. But right, this is the income, right, that they make from having this kind of corporate executive level job. Now, of course, you might be like, hey, where's somebody like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos? Well, there is this distinction between income and wealth, right? So income is, you have a job and your compensation, right, that you get for that job. Wealth is you own stocks, you own businesses. You are now no longer earning an income. You are making money through your assets, right? Through those stocks and bonds and investments. And so it's worth noting that, especially when we're talking about this capitalist and corporate managerial class, that very select few who are far richer than the rest, they are usually the billionaires, the multi-billionaires, that they are now not even drawing income, right? They are living on investments, and the amount of money they have, of course, far exceeds, what's even on that CEO income chart. Bill Gates in 2018 was 86 billion. And he's given away 30 billion, more than anyone in history. But the fact that you can give away billions and still be a billionaire, many times over, is just it definitely says something about that small but sizable percentage of people in America, who are the upper class. And so this is where we get this idea, right, that the wealthiest 1% of Americans, they own 35% of the nation's wealth, right? When we're considering stocks, bonds, assets, investments, 1% of Americans own over 1/3 of those types of resources. Now, the middle class is a much larger group than the upper class. 44% of Americans self-identify as middle class. And it's worth noting that, a lot of Americans say that they're middle class because, just in terms of social psychology, they know people that have less than them and they know people that have more than them. So it's worth noting that just because someone says they're middle class doesn't mean that a sociologist would always necessarily identify them as being middle class. But since Cohen is interested in social class largely through this class identity, class as a group perspective, it makes sense that he would focus on how people self identify. Historically, this is a group that's had relatively stable jobs, usually because they're salaried versus, hourly. And a lot of those jobs are related to either higher education or technical skills or, specific credentials. They definitely have a more modest standard of living than the upper class, but they usually can pretty easily meet their basic needs, such as healthcare, which, because they often have salary jobs with benefits, it comes through their job, as well as education, right? They are much more likely to send their children on to college, being college graduates largely themselves. And among this group, there is a high rate of home ownership. That's traditionally, although you can kind of look at some of the issues that the millennial generation is having in regards to home ownership, and question how true that is. This is a class that I want to compare to the ladder approach, because in the ladder approach, they usually break the middle class into two groups: the upper middle class and the lower middle class. Where usually one of the major distinctions of the upper middle class is that they make a minimum of six figures, and that almost always they have a college degree, not just a post-secondary degree, but a graduate or professional degree. While the lower middle class is more of a hodgepodge of people. They often went to college, but sometimes they could be also members of like well compensated, trade, or small business owners. And the key thing about being in the lower middle class is usually they make like above right yeah, above the median income in America. So usually is somewhere around 50 to 55,000. And so that's, like I said, the latter approach. But it's worth noting, especially for people who don't readily study sociology, in terms of class identity, a lot of people just say they're middle class. They don't necessarily distinguish between that upper versus middle. The next group is the working class. And so this is the other group that a lot of people identify as. Usually, one of the major distinctions between them and the middle class is that lack of higher education or specialized training. Um, their standard of living is similar to the middle class, but they often have more instability in terms of finances, maybe because their jobs might be more are less likely to be salary, more likely to be hourly. Maybe they have jobs that are tied, much more closely to like the fluctuations of the economy. If they're like a trade or like a managerial person, like in the service industry, jobs that we saw take a big hit, for instance, with the pandemic. Um, and the book notes that their jobs are less secure than what they once were, because there are less government protections, as well as the strength of unions has declined. So, the instability of the working class today is much greater than the instability of the working class, 40, 50 years ago, where in the at that time, the primary distinction between the working class and the middle class, probably back then, you probably couldn't even necessarily tell by looking at their like just lifestyle, and in terms of like home ownership and owning a car and that type of thing. But now, with that greater financial instability, we are seeing some real distinctions between the working class and the middle class. And so this is where I'm going to introduce two terms that can kind of help make sense of the distinction between the working class and the middle class, since sometimes they can overlap when it comes to income. That maybe can shed some light on how they are perceived differently in society. One of those terms is occupation. So this is a person's main vacation or paid employment. One thing is that we oftentimes associate white collar positions with the middle class. These are positions that almost always require formal education. They aren't necessarily their office jobs, and all office jobs aren't well paid jobs, but it's worth noting that, most office jobs are salaried and they do come with certain benefits. Blue collar occupations we associate more with the working class. They tend to be manual labor. They tend to be associated with trade. If they're not, if you're working for someone and they're hourly, if you're working for yourself, obviously it's, you're getting paid by the job. And so in this way, it's not that the amount of money is necessarily different than the white collar job, but what is different is, like I said, that stability of income and the presence of benefits or no benefits. Pink collar is a lot of blue collar work. The manual labor and trades is dominated by men, and usually it's people that have maybe a credential, or they went through some type of apprenticeship program, but they don't necessarily have a post-secondary degree. Pink collar is the female version of blue collar work, in the sense that these are the jobs that are held by predominantly by women who do not have a college degree. However, these jobs are oftentimes seen as being less skilled than blue collar work. They're seen as semi skilled, and so they tend to be lower paid. And so, especially, later on in this lecture, when we talk about why women have a greater likelihood of being in poverty and female headed households have a greater likelihood of being impoverished, think about what, I'm saying here. If you don't go to college and you're a man, there is a much greater chance that you will find yourself in one of these blue collar positions where, although there is some financial instability, there is also this ability to make a really good living. If you are a woman and you don't go to college, and no one's preventing you from going into a trade or a blue collar position, but it's worth noting that a lot of women don't. Instead, they find themselves doing things like working, as a domestic, or working, in the service industry as, a sales clerk, or a hotel, front desk, or hotel cleaning staff, waitress. All of this is what we consider to be pink collar. All of those are going to pay a lot less than like blue collar work, like construction, plumbing, auto mechanics. So that kind of distinction between white collar and blue collar is one contributing factor to, how, why we see middle class and working class as separate classes, even if sometimes their income is very similar. But then also there is the prestige of these occupations, because prestige is the respect and regard associated with social position. And so when you think about, like, why do we respect some positions more than others, a lot of positions, certainly one thing that affects prestige is we tend to think highly of jobs that provide a service to the community. So jobs, like teacher, like social worker, like firefighter, like police officer, although certainly, the recent social movements have called, into question whether or not that's true of, everyone in the community. But in addition to that, we oftentimes also think highly of positions that, require a lot of training or education. And we also tend to think more highly of jobs that are, better compensated. And so in this way, what happens is, although it's not a perfect, distinction, where working class occupations are less likely to be seen with high prestige than uh, middle class occupations, there does tend to be a bit of a relationship, between prestige, occupation, and social class. And the government actually collects this information. It is an additional survey that goes out, in the same way that they collect census data, and things like that. And we call this prestige scales. And so I don't know why. There we go. So this just gives you an example of like what in other countries collect this information as well. So prestige scales literally go from 0 to 100. So obviously the closer the score is to 100, that means that this is a higher prestige job, and the closer it is to, zero is a job that's ranked as lower prestige. And so I just give you an example of some of the higher, uh, you know, uh, ranked occupations, some of the more prestigious ones, and then also some of the ones that are lower. Once again, this isn't always, this taps into that uh, privilege and status component of social class, not necessarily the income component. Because you can look at some of those lower prestige jobs and say, hey, there are people that make really good livings as a barber. There are people that make really good livings as a truck driver. Garbage collector. Hey, that's a very like stable, government position. But so we aren't just talking about money here, but we're talking about uh, this social psychological kind of element when we're talking about prestige. And then this brings me to the final group that Cohen identifies, the lower class. And he notes that 8% of people self-identify as lower class, but the true proportion is thought to be larger. And before I talk more about what Cohen says about this is another group that I want to go back to, the latter, because I think this can shed some light on why don't more people self-identify. Because on the latter, they have two groups, a group that they call the working poor, and a group that sometimes is called the underclass, sometimes they're called like the very poor, the truly poor. But these are two distinct groups. The working poor, these are people who they work every day, they work full time, but they usually work for minimum wage in a state or city where minimum wage is definitely not a living wage. And so they find themselves like right at the poverty line. And this is about, according, and this isn't self-identification, this is kind of looking at government collected data. This is about 15% of the population. And then people who, the latter refers to as underclass, these are people that are largely unemployed or inconsistently employed, or maybe only work part time, or maybe they live on some form of government assistance, and they are below the poverty line. And this is actually 5%. So, what you can imagine is, part of the reason why so many people self identify as poor is because if you're part of the underclass, you probably conclusively see yourself as poor. But especially if you're the type of person that gets up and goes to work every day, even though you might on some level realize that you are poor, that you are right at the poverty line, just in terms of social psychology, that might just not be a label that you would like to take on for yourself, because the negative stereotypes people have about people in poverty, making assumptions about them being lazy or not hardworking. And if you are one of those people that is working very hard, you just aren't earning a lot of money, you may not want to identify with that class, right? You may not want to adopt that class identity, even if your resources and even if your experiences suggest that that is the class that you are a part of. All right. Going back to kind of Cohen's description of the lower class, he notes that oftentimes they don't have a higher education. In some cases, they maybe didn't even graduate high school, and so this limits their ability to gain employment, particularly skill jobs. And so if they are working, they are working these jobs that aren't going to be able to lift them out of poverty. So they have very low incomes, and and a high degree of economic insecurity. And this might impact their ability to access medical care, housing. They might experience food insecurity. But what's important to note, and we'll talk more about this in a few slides, the fact of the matter is even with them experiencing those things, they still might not be eligible for any type of real assistance, because that type of assistance might be limited to the people that we would call the very poor. And we'll talk more about that, about who receives government assistance, cash assistance, in this country, because it's not as many groups of people as I think some people imagine that it is. So, sometimes there's this debate in America that, especially since our country likes to tell ourselves, that you can grow up to be anything, and we overstate the amount of mobility that exists in this country. We might say that social class doesn't matter. And unless you're talking about the billionaires, the other thing, because we don't have that kind of history of an aristocracy and a landed gentry and titles, there is this assumption that, there aren't these dramatic differences between the upper middle, lower middle, and working classes in particular, especially in light of things like, loans that allow people to buy homes, loans that allow people to buy cars even if they can't afford them, credit cards that allow people, to perpetrate like they really can't afford, designer handbags and fancy sneakers and the latest technology. So we give off this appearance of classlessness sometimes. I'm not saying I agree, that we are classless. I do think we have social classes in our country, and I do think, that the experiences between social classes is a lot more distinct than what maybe a casual observer would notice. But, I do understand the argument when some people say, like, hey, unless you're talking about the billionaires, the super rich, and unless you're talking about the poor, like everyone else kind of blends together. And so this is why even people who don't necessarily think that America has a very classed society, the poor has always been the one social class that, for the most part, people will agree definitively matters. And so when we're talking about the poor, it's important to kind of, make sure that we're all on the same page about who do we mean when we refer to the poor. And so to define the poor, there are, several different ways you can define the poor. Um, there's absolute poverty. That is someone who does not have the resources, the ability to meet their basic needs. They do not have food, shelter, sufficient clothing. And so in our society, the best example of that would, of course, be the homeless. This is a very narrow definition of poverty, though, right? Because basically, we would be saying if you're not homeless, you're not poor. Um, Another example would be relative poverty. That means that you are poor when compared to the standard of living in your given community. And so the problem with relative poverty is it's very subjective. It's based on how people feel when kind of comparing themselves to what they perceive to be, the average person, the average lifestyle in their community. And then, of course, it raises the question, like if you're talking about very wealthy communities where, like, maybe people have, a second home and they have two luxury cars, right? But you only have one home and one older Honda. Do we really want to call you poor just because you're relatively poor for, I don't know, Beverly Hills? Um, and so that's a lot more subjective. It really kind of taps in you feeling poor for your area. And so obviously, that concept is just has less utility for researchers. So the definition of poverty we often rely on is official poverty, which is based on the government recognizing that you are poor because you meet the definitions as set out by the poverty line. And I'm going to discuss the poverty line in an upcoming slide. But to give you a sense of what those guidelines look like, this is from 2019. And so it's based on family size. And so if you are below this number, then you are below the poverty line. And, there are different formulas and equations established for certain government assistance programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what we, commonly refer to as food stamps, or, housing vouchers, Section 8 vouchers. So we build those types of government assistance programs around this official poverty definition. Before I talk more about the official poverty definition and the poverty line, two other terms that you should know are temporary poverty and persistent poverty. So, what we know is that in our country, pre pandemic, particularly, um, there are a large number of people who are temporary, who experience temporary poverty. They don't earn above the poverty line, but it's for a relatively short period of time. We're talking in a lot of cases less than 3 years, right? So they move out of poverty. Doesn't mean they necessarily move poor. I mean that they necessarily move significantly up. But they might just move from being poor to working poor. But for government purposes, the fact that they are not below the poverty line for a long established period of time means that we consider them to be experiencing temporary poverty, right? So maybe you lost your job, or maybe you went through a divorce, or maybe your parents kicked you out of the house. So you go through this period of temporary poverty. We're more concerned about people that experience persistent poverty, because that suggests that this isn't just a fleeting financial status, but for some reason or another, they are spending the bulk of their lives, being below the poverty line. And that, of course, comes with its own like consequences and risk. And particularly, if they are, heading a family. And so it's not just them, but, perhaps they're, young dependents. We're very concerned, of course, about kind of the ramifications of that. But let's talk a little bit more about the poverty line, because this is a good example of how the state arena gets involved, by crafting policy meant to address poverty. And so the poverty line was created in the 1960s, and it was based on a formula that basically multiplied, how much money a family would need in order to sufficiently feed a family of a certain size. And your book gives you the specifics there. It was based on an equation that accounted for food being about one third of a family's expense. Now, and we still use this equation today. We have not changed the equation, even though it has some very clear flaws, which I will address in the next slide. But part of why we still use the poverty line is it does allow us, like I said, to establish this official poverty status, and from the government standpoint, it allows them to determine eligibility for government assistance programs. For the researcher standpoint, it allows us to talk about poverty, compare poverty over time in this really kind of objective, consistent way, which is harder to do if you're using relative poverty, or you're using, you're allowing people to self-identify as poor. So, it is helpful, for both researchers as well as government officials, bureaucrats, to have this official poverty line. But like I said, there are some problems. Largely, the fact is is cheaper than what it was back then. The price of food has risen more slowly than the price of housing and medical care. So using a food budget times three in order to determine how much money a family needs is insufficient, because people are spending a lot more on housing and medical expenses and gas and for their automobiles, than the type of money that was being spent in the 1960s. It also doesn't take into account the different cost of living, right? So it's set by the federal government. um, and this is why for some state-run programs, not federal programs, but for some state-run programs, especially in high cost of living states like California, if you were to go to their website and pull up the information for their state administered programs, you'll see that they have a much higher line. But especially if you are trying to take advantage of the benefits that come from the federal government, they don't make a state by state distinction. So, in that sense, saying that a family of four can adequately live on 25,000, yeah, that might work for Arkansas. That probably works a lot less well in, New York City. So the poverty line does have some problems, but because it is, like I said, a very objective measurement, and it's been very consistent, or consistently defined, it does allow us to kind of look at the data that we have about poverty in America and make some important observations. So poverty peaked in 2010. That was the height of the recession. um, we don't have the data, we don't have a full look yet of exactly, what is happening, during this pandemic. But I'm sure that, that decline that we have experienced steadily since 2010 has probably, gone inched back up in the last year. We do know that there are some distinctions by race, that there's some distinctions by family structure, there's some distinctions by age. And as I've already noted, for a lot of people, poverty is not persistent, but is temporary, and they can move in and out of it. They can cycle in and out of poverty over their lifetimes. So I just have some graphs here. I'm just going to point out a couple of like quick observations from each. So this is looking at the states that have a high percentage of people in poverty. Purple states have the least. Uh, Teal states have the most, and you can see that there is a lot of poverty that's concentrated in my part of the country, the South, going into the Southwest, and a lot of this just has to do with lack of economic opportunities. But a lot of this also has to do with, the relationship that we see between poverty and race. And so there are kind of two ways we can talk about like the racial breakdown of poverty. If we talk about the percentage of the US poor who are from each of these groups, looking at the pie chart, you'd say, okay, well, the greatest percentage of uh, you know, uh, race in terms of percentages when it comes to poverty are white non-Hispanics, followed by Latinos, followed by African Americans, and so forth, right? But that doesn't really account for the differences in the size of those groups. See, because we know that whites make up almost 60 some percent of the country, while Latinos make up about 17% and African Americans make up 12%. So when we look at it in terms of the disproportionate, if we look at it in terms of proportions in poverty, this kind of changes the picture, because if we look at it in that sense, we see that 24% so almost one quarter of African Americans, and or a little over one quarter of African Americans and a little under of one quarter of Latinos are poor, like so almost one out of four. Um, and if you look at for whites, it's 13%. So a little bit over one out of 10. And so, understanding kind of that distinction between, percentages and proportions, this is why we say that disproportionately poverty is experienced by people of color. And figure 4.8 pretty much is making that very similar point, but um, they're adding in American Indians who have an even higher percentage than blacks and African American, black African Americans or Latinos, and they're separating Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders from Asians because they have a higher percentage of their population in poverty than East Asians or Southeast Asians. And so it's useful to kind of look at them separately. uh, there is this relationship between age. Children and the elderly tend to be most vulnerable, and that's because of course they have limited abilities to take care of themselves within the job market. If you are an adult of working age. You can always work 2 jobs, work 3 jobs. There are plenty of Americans who unfortunately do have to do that in order to make ends meet, but that is less of a possibility as you become older, 65 and older. And then, of course, it's a pretty much an impossibility when you are a young child, because there are laws that prevent children from working. So, once again, and they break this down by race. You can kind of just see that, um, especially for minorities, that they're elderly, for both Asians, Latinos, and African Americans, have a much greater risk of being poor. And then for children, um, certainly for Latinos and African Americans, a much greater likelihood of being poor. And obviously some of this is also related to education, because your ability to get a stable job, a high paying job, the type of job that will help lift you out of poverty, it isn't perfectly predicated by predicted by education obtained, but there is a strong correlation there. But especially just kind of focusing on child poverty, and your book does make this point. Part of this does have a lot to do with, and the differences in race, um, uh, in child poverty does have a lot to do with family structure. Um, Households that are headed by single parents have a much greater risk of being impoverished. Just a one income versus two type of thing. But then, even if you just compare between it being headed by a man versus a woman, you'll see that for women, it is a greater risk of a female headed household being in poverty. There's actually a special term for that called the feminization of poverty. And this has a lot to do with what I was discussing earlier, the types of jobs that are typically held by men and women, and the different levels of compensation that exist between these blue collar jobs and pink collar jobs. Or even when men and women are working similar jobs, we do know that there's a wage gap, and we do know that the wage gap becomes more significant if you're talking about women with children versus single women. So single mothers, they experience real liabilities in the labor market, and it results in diminished income. Particularly if you're talking about women who do not have a higher education. And so they're more likely to head households that are impoverished, resulting in, a growing number of children who, are living their lives, starting their lives, in this social class group of the poor, by no real fault or choice of their own. And you can kind of see that the number of children in poverty, varies by state, where you have some states where it's almost a quarter of children are living, at or below the poverty line, which I I always breaks my heart, the idea that in some states, one out of every four little faces that you look in, are experiencing, that level of financial insecurity and instability. Um, in a country where, at the same time, we have people that are, doing so well, as discussed when we were talking about the upper class and the super rich. Your book focuses specifically on one consequence of poverty, which is eviction. And they quote sociologist Matthew Desmond, just, making the point that millions of people are evicted each year. And the recommendation is that you spend about one third of your income on housing. But depending on how much money you make, and especially depending on where you live, there are a lot of families where it's well over 50%. And if you're spending that much of your money on housing, all it takes is a few things going wrong, some unexpected expense, car accident, or maybe a medical expenditure, or maybe you lose your job. because if you're spending that much of of your monthly income on housing, you certainly aren't able to save a significant amount. And so this results in, of course, if you can't pay your rent, it results in eviction. And so they talk about how evictions have become much more common, um, and that certainly this is one thing that has contributed in some cities to a huge surge in their homeless population, particularly if you're talking about, homelessness faced by women and children, who we sometimes call the economic homeless, because they are homeless solely because of economic circumstances, right, as opposed to homelessness that is contributed to mental illness or addiction issues. And so this is the first of your suggested readings for this chapter. And it really is just kind of it provides you more context about the book by Desmond, Evicted. And specifically, he found that eviction has disproportionately impacted Black women. And a lot of that just kind of being because of the higher concentration of uh, families headed by single Black women in urban areas, in cities, where eviction is just a much more common, a much more common tactic among landlords. And so, reading that article, um, I really want you to just kind of consider some of the short and term and long term consequences of eviction, on families, on the lives of the adults, as well as the lives of their children, their dependents. So, what has our country done to address poverty? To discuss that, we need to talk about the welfare system. So there's some countries that we refer to as welfare states, meaning these are countries that offer a very strong social safety net. So people in those countries know that there are programs and policies that are set up to provide temporary, maybe even long-term assistance related to housing, related to medical care, related to food, um, and just cash assistance. Well, the United States is not one of the countries that we would classify as being a welfare state. We do not have a strong enough or a sufficient enough social safety net for us to classify as that type of country. We are not a Sweden, for instance, or a Germany. Um, we do have some social welfare programs, and these are, organized efforts by the government, but also by private organizations or individual to assist needy people. And depending on whether it's a government, a private organization, or an individual, how they define someone as being needy and worthy of assistance can vary. But particularly, I'm going to focus on the government, because the programs provided by the government are meant to be more stable and consistent. We know that nonprofit organizations, their fortunes can fluctuate, depending on the overall economy, right, because they are dependent on grants from the government, but also donations from individuals. And certainly individuals, their ability to provide social welfare programs, can fluctuate based on their own kind of economic circumstances. But the government social welfare program, is institutionalized policy, so it's meant to be more stable. So in our country, we oftentimes talk about government assistance using the terminology of waves, because there really wasn't a concentrated, cohesive type of approach until the first wave, which was instituted by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and as part of his New Deal programs. So, this is coming in the 30s uh, as a way of addressing, of course, the fallout of the Great Depression. So some of the programs that we still have today, programs like Medicare, programs like Social Security, um, they were implemented by FDR as he looked around and noticed that some of the most vulnerable people in society, especially in light of the depression, were really struggling, and he realized that the government had to provide some type of assistance to these people. He also started, some early cash assistance programs um, for women who, not just widows, but women, because we discussed previously that some of that came out of the Civil War as well. But now women whose husbands had abandoned them as a result of the Great Depression. It wasn't quite formalized into a full, ongoing program. We saw that in the second wave of government assistance programs, which came under President Lyndon B. Johnson, who, of course, took over after the assassination of President Kennedy. And he called his programs the War on Poverty. And so, in addition to Medicare, which provides health care to senior citizens, Lyndon B. Johnson introduced Medicaid, which provided health care to people who were low income, but also met the criteria of being either pregnant or under the age of 18 or over the age of 65 or, had a disability. Um, he also, implemented AFDC, which was our cash assistance program given to primarily women, that were single mothers. They did not necessarily have to be widows, and they didn't have to necessarily be, previously married, unlike the FDR program. And so it provided cash assistance to your household for every child under the age of 18 that was in your household. And so, those were kind of the major introductions of the second wave. The third wave is primarily associated with President Bill Clinton, although some of, Barack, there's some debate about whether, Barack Obama's, efforts to jumpstart the economy after the Great Recession should be part of that wave, or does it constitute a fourth wave? Most people just put it part as the third wave, but the real policy standout that happened in the third wave, it wasn't an extension of benefits unlike the first and second wave. It was kind of the diminishing of benefits, because President Clinton, ran on the promise to end welfare as we know it, for his second reelection. And so when he was reelected, he did just that. He turned AFDC, Assistance to Families with Dependent Children, to TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And there were some very important changes when AFDC became TANF. The first one is kind of right there in the title, temporary. He allowed it up to the states, but basically the states could decide how long to offer cash assistance to a single mother who was poor, for her children, with the maximum being 5 years, right? So you could start and stop your clock, but it wasn't going to extend beyond 5 years, even if you had more children. Along with this, they also, instituted working and education requirements, which basically said, they left it up to the state, but the state was allowed to say, like, hey, you either have to go to school or you have to take part in like a work fair program in order to receive this money. It's worth noting that at the time the economy was doing really well, and so it was lauded as a success. Not to mention, people really ever since the 1980s have been really hard on women who received cash assistance for their children. We have Reagan to kind of thank for that, with that idea of the welfare queen. So because we were in kind of an economic boom period, uh, the impact to AFDC to TANF wasn't immediately, felt. Um, but as our economy became less strong in the next 10 or 15 years, but states still kind of, if anything, some states even, you know, diminish, the time clock even further. I think right now Arizona has one of the lowest time clocks at 18 months. This is part of why we saw an increase, beginning in the early aughts and escalating as we went into the Great Recession of our child poverty numbers, because the money that would have maybe helped keep some of those families, would have helped propel some of them out of poverty, was now no longer a possibility. And so, as we're talking about social class and what it means to be part of a class, or part of a social class, you know, all of this, of course, is happening during a time where, just taking a step back and looking at the overall inequality in our society, um, that has changed. There's always been, in America, the upper class and the middle class and the working class and the lower class, but the distinction between, the resources enjoyed by the upper versus lower class, or the upper versus even working class, that's really changed over time, because for the last 50 years there has been an increasing growth of inequality. And so your book describes what the Gini index is, and they do that so you can understand, that bottom graph. So it's a measure of inequality where 0 equals complete equality and 1 represents complete inequality. America has an index of 0.45. And so, Cohen notes we're lower than some places like Brazil, and we're higher than some places like Germany. But I think what's maybe more interesting is if you look at our Gini index over time, right? The fact is, we had some lows in the 60s and the 70s where we were like at 35. And now, or, in 2018, we were now kind of approaching 46. And that's because if you look at it in terms of income, you can see that the amount of money that is earned by uh, the upper class has dramatically increased, while the amount of money that's earned by the lower class and the working class has largely remained stable, um, over time. Even though, of course, with inflation, if you were lower class and making, 20,000 in 1968, that's going to feel very different than what it feels like, in 2020, 2021. And so, why have we had this increase in growing economic inequality? Well, that's kind of goes beyond the scope of this class, but there are some kind of important factors just to kind of understand. Part of it is kind of the nature of capitalism itself. If capitalists are going to be focused on profits, that is going to be incentive to keep wages low. And if you're following kind of the debate around, the living wage and, $15 as a federal minimum, you probably have seen people argue, oh, places would have to close, right? Or, or oh, now services, now your burger is going to cost 3 times as much. But that's really only if they want to keep their profit margins at what they are. If people were willing to accept less profit, then they could pay their workers more. But that almost just kind of defeats the purpose of capitalism, where the end goal is profit. Now, of course, when unions were stronger, they were able to advocate for workers, and more money, and more benefits, and some very important policies like the maximum hour workday, like holidays, like child labor laws, they came out of, the labor movement and unions. But unions have lost power, and that's because, historically, a lot of the strongest unions were associated with factories in the manufacturing sector. But beginning in the 70s and escalating in the 80s and 90s, we've seen a period of deindustrialization where the number of jobs available in the manufacturing sector have dramatically declined due to globalization. People are putting their factories in other countries, due to automation. Jobs that used to be done by people can now be done by robots and technology, so you don't have to hire as many people. And so people who want factory jobs now, instead of having a strong kind of negotiation point, you know those people can be easily replaced, which makes it hard for them to unionize. And these manufacturing jobs, largely were replaced by service sector work. And service sector work tends to just have lower pay, fewer benefits, and because it's seen as less skilled, um, it's less likely to be unionized because the idea is we can easily replace you. And these types of jobs have also been dominated by women. And like I said, historically, they've been paid less money, and contemporary, they're still paid less money. And so that's been a contributing factor. Certainly in our country, we have this legacy of discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. We really didn't even try to tackle it as a country until the mid 60s and 70s. And then by the 80s, there was a backlash against a lot of the programs and policies that were meant to set up to address, hundreds of years of discrimination. Only so much improvement was done in about a decade and a half. Obviously, with gender, same issue there. Uh, didn't even really begin to address it into the 70s. Been less of a backlash. But certainly, like I said, if you are a woman with children, a single woman with children that has children, you face a lot of liabilities in the job market, even more so than a single woman who doesn't have children. And then, of course, kind of what we're now seeing and having to figure out how to address via policy and court cases is the discrimination that people experience due to their sexuality, as well as the disability. And part of why, in general, a lot of policies that maybe would address, some of these contributing factors that I've already kind of outlined, that contribute to inequality. Part of why a lot of policies have not necessarily been implemented is because people who are benefiting from this class system, people who are part of the upper class, they use their disproportionate political influence to generate policies favorable to their position. We see this with taxation policies. In particular, we see this with, the fact that the United States, unlike a lot of other countries, doesn't have a very strong inheritance tax. And so, in this upcoming section, when we talk about class permanence, this is part of why class identity and class position can become so entrenched, right? Sam Walton created Walmart. He's been long dead. Three Waltons are on the top 10 list of billionaires. What did they do besides being lucky enough to be born into the family of Sam Walton, who created Walmart? But, because we don't have a very high tax rate on inheritance, we don't really shake up our resources. They can kind of remain entrenched in these families, which is the point that Cohen was making when he was talking about, the Winstons. So your textbook, they approach discussing, inequality by kind of talking about the issues that, impact the people at the bottom, the people in the middle, and the people at the top. And so some of these are things that I've already discussed. Like I already discussed the female-headed households. I've already discussed the fact that the push for the federal minimum wage to be increased, hasn't hasn't been embraced. At the federal level, there have been some cities and states that have increased their minimum wage, but the federal minimum wage is still $7.25, at least in 2021, as I'm making this video. Cohen talks about in the middle, it's been a divergent fortune, and this is where that distinction, I think, between the lower middle class and the upper middle class is important. It becomes important, even though Cohen just talks about it as the middle class, because the upper middle class, with their post-secondary degrees, and in a lot of cases, their advanced graduate professional degrees, they are moving into positions where they have the potential to earn a high income, stability. They're positions that usually provide them with health insurance at very little cost, or to themselves. And then they tend to marry other people like them, right, which Cohen knows, endogamous marriages. And so they take their resources and they take their social capital, and they engage in class closure. Well, the lower middle class, particularly if they were the lower middle class and they were kind of getting that position through blue collar positions and small businesses and trained skill work. Well, with the decline of manufacturing, and with a national economy that's really had some pretty severe up and downs in the last like 10 to 15 years, um, you know, they have now experienced a lot of financial instability, and so they have not been able to successfully secure these types of class resources, the way the upper middle class has. And then of course at the top, your book talks about, like, yes, there's the upper class, but then there is the super rich, and the trend to watch, according to Cohen, is the 1%. Like I said, the fact that they earn so much of the income, but maybe even more importantly, have so much of the wealth. And with that lack of inheritance tax, and with the changes in taxation policies, they aren't losing money. Their families aren't losing money. They're going to be set for generations. And that is less resources, of course, to kind of cycle through the economy for the rest of us. And I have a picture there of Jeff Bezos and his ex-wife, Madison, because she became a billionaire, after their divorce, because she got half of their, she was with him pre-Amazon, and helped building that, and she got half of that. And she has very aggressively, started to give away, a lot of this massive fortune, um, with the knowledge, of course, does any one person need, six, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 billion dollars, a year? Because that's the thing, is when you are living on your investments, this becomes mailbox money that is largely self-generating, right? It's not like it's not like having a high paid job where you still might lose that job or become disabled and unable to perform that job, right? If your money is primarily through investments and assets, unless you just make a whole lot of bad decisions as an individual, or unless the whole system crashes, at the societal level, the fact of the matter is once you become part of the 1%, you're probably always going to be part of the 1%. And that's something that our country really just hasn't accounted for, in terms of our policies. And so this brings me to the last part of the chapter, which, discusses mobility and class persistence. So the great thing about living in a class system versus a caste system, where you're born in a position and you're going to stay in that position your entire life, there's nothing you can do to rise above that position. In a class position, because your position is largely based on education, occupation, income, status, those are things that possibly might change over your lifetime. So there is movement up and down between the social classes now. And but what we need to ask ourselves, follow-up questions, is rate of movement. How much mobility is occurring within a society? And this is where I like to emphasize the term structural mobility, because we talk about it as if it's just aspirations, like people wanting to do better, people wanting to get ahead. But there have to be positions for people to move into. And this is why sometimes we experience the greatest amount of mobility when a kind of new economic frontier is opened, right? So we saw this, of course, with the dot-com boom, and then we saw it with the app boom. And I don't know if they ever open up space and space travel becomes a thing for, like, even everyday people. We'll probably see a boom there, right? Because these positions open up, and if you are motivated, if you are well positioned, if you have the skills and talents, you can potentially move into those new positions. But keyword is, those positions have to be available to you, because otherwise the rate of mobility within a society usually isn't that great. And a lot of that has to do with class permanence, which we'll talk about in a few more slides. So that's rate of mobility. Direction of mobility, which is more common, upward or downward. Obviously, in times of recession, downward mobility becomes a lot more common than upward mobility. Periods of upward mobility, like I said, they are related to, when we have a new kind of economic, uh, sector that opens up. We saw great upward mobility, during the 60s and the 70s, as policies were passed to address some of the racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination that had held people of color and women, back from a lot of middle class and upper middle class professions and opportunities. Um, but in a lot of cases, it's usually almost like neutral. Yeah, there's some upward, there's some downward, there isn't a clear trend. And once again, that just kind of emphasizes the structural elements that underlie mobility. And then finally, as a country that loves to tell ourselves rags to riches stories, um, how often, how common is it, in the words of Drake, to start from the bottom and be here, and here being like, a millionaire. Um, those stories are really rare. Usually they are dependent upon, you having some, rare talent in the world of entertainment, or making some, great discovery or achievement. And, even when people point to people like Bill Gates, it's like, well, yes, no, Bill Gates did not grow up in a billionaire family, but Bill Gates was also not dirt poor. Bill Gates grew up middle class, which did provide him some advantages. It did open, his folks did have the resources to expose him, uh, and to provide for him, some of that early technology that captured his interest and became a passion, and allowed him to develop Microsoft, which of course then made him a billionaire. So true rags to riches stories are very rare. And once again, when we start talking about class permanence, it'll become clear as to why. So, as Cohen notes, historically, Americans have had this belief that we live in a society with a high degree of social mobility. And now, people are much more pessimistic about that idea, that there's a lot of opportunity for the average person to get ahead. Um, we can study how much mobility has happened. And your book notes that one way of studying it in a lot of classical studies was by comparing the occupations of fathers with the occupations of sons. And so you can kind of see, that uh, uh, the likelihood that an upper professional father, that their son would be an upper professional, was very high. um, and the same thing, an unskilled service father was most likely to have a son that was going to do the same thing. So we call this comparing mobility across generations. We call this intergenerational mobility. Um, comparing how you're doing versus your parents versus your grandparents. Another way we can talk about mobility is just the mobility experienced in one lifetime by focusing on one person. So, the household you were born into versus the household that maybe you have, when you're middle age versus, the social class that you're in, that your household is in, by the time you die. I tell students the best way to remember the difference between intergenerational and intragenerational is intra A. If you say you have a dog, if you say you have a toy, if you say you have a hot dog, you have one singular. And so intragenerational mobility is looking at mobility through one person's life time, while inter is comparing across generations. And so, yeah, we don't really have, research suggests that we just don't have this level of mobility that a lot of people maybe think that we do. And when comparing ourselves to other wealthy countries, we have less mobility than those countries, places like Germany and Sweden and France. If we compare ourselves even to our own country, but just, 30, 50, 60 years ago, we have less upward mobility now than in previous generations. Um, and as I noted, one contributing factor to class persistence has been uh, inheritance, and certainly Americans' reluctance to overly tax inheritance. In this way, the rich remain rich, and everyone else is just kind of fighting for what's left. But let's talk a little bit more about all the Americans where inheritance isn't really the issue. What's contributing to the class persistence in those groups? Well, your book talks specifically about the role of family structure here. That family structure has an impact on social class mobility, and social class persistence. Because as I stated, we can look at the data, multiple different forms of data from different researchers, and the clear trend we see is that children are likely to remain in the same social class as the one in which they grew up in. Um, and so one contributing factor to that is seems to be family structure. That children who grow up in low income households um, are more likely to be living in households where it is being headed by a single parent, usually a single mother, versus a married couple. And so why is this so significant? How does this then contribute to class persistence? Um, well, Cohen breaks it down in terms of three different forms of resources that a single parent is going to struggle with more so than a married couple. And that's money, time, and social capital. And so let's talk about all three of these separately, beginning with money. This seems to be the most important factor, which, just makes it's common sense. Um, Married parents oftentimes have higher household income than a single parent, and especially if it's a single mother, because we've already talked about the feminization of poverty. So if you grow up in this type of household where money is an issue, you're going to be more likely to just experience economic uncertainty and insecurity. It may result in you living in a less than desirable neighborhood. It might result in you going to a uh, less well-funded school system, where there are less educational opportunities, and you don't receive as strong of an education as people at another school. It may result in you living in the type of neighborhood that's more likely to be plagued by crime, including violent crime. Um, you might live in a household where, because you're experiencing things like eviction or food insecurity or the shutting down of utilities, you might be under more pressure to work and contribute, which impacts your dedication to school and your ability to maybe even pursue post-secondary education. So in all these ways, money It's not about love, it's not about desire or, wanting to provide your child a better life, but just that actual tangible resource of how much money is in your household. That's a major distinction between uh, two parent households and one parent households. But the other issue is time. If you have two parents, you have double the adults that can provide the time, the focus, uh, the care, the attention to the dependents. Single parents have less time to spend with their children. Single mothers, even more so, because once again, they're more likely to be working jobs that are lower compensated, which means that they are working perhaps two jobs, or they are doing additional side hustles in order to to address the money issue, which then results in a lack of parental time with their child. And this is important in regards to support. It's important in regards to academic preparation. It's important in regards, especially as you get into the kind of preteen teen years, lack of supervision. And so, especially as we've seen a rise in the media, TV and laptops and internet, so screen time, this also then impacts the child in the fact that, we see that there is this digital divide because the difference in media time for children whose parents are, less educated. You can kind of see in the amount of time that they are spending on TV, on games, is greater than parents that have gone to college. And although it's worth noting that the quality of media is a much of concern is quantity, right? Because if you're watching documentaries, then that 2 hours is going to have a potentially different payoff than 2 hours spent uh, on scrolling social media. And it's really that idea, and that brings us to the final resource difference in families, and that is the idea that uh, single parent households have less social capital. And once again, and this one is once again reflects the fact that certainly not all single parents are coming from working class, working poor, low income backgrounds, but there is a greater proportion of single parents households that are in that social class, as opposed to the number of two parent households that are, middle class, upper middle class, and therefore have access to these cultural resources and can expose their children to these cultural resources and connections and networks that then might benefit them later on the road, right? Whether it's theater programs or museums or, mentoring programs and these other experiences that don't just expose children to culture and to opportunities, but also, like I said, connects them potentially with other well-connected people, both adults and peers, which just increases their social capital. And so the final part of this chapter um, addresses kind of an additional distinction that we see in social classes that contributes to class persistence. Um, and this one is not necessarily just solely related to family structure. This is just comparing across the classes, and that's family practices. In general, parents love their children, they care about their children, they want them to do well, they want them to get ahead. And even when parents do everything right, their children still may not succeed. But there are these family practices that differ between families of different social classes, and just in terms of societal reward, we've gotten to this point in our society where we tend to reward the family practices that reflect upper middle class, upper class lifestyles and values more so than working class or working poor. And so this just shows you some data that has been um, uh, collected uh, about, sitting down and eating dinner together, spending time with your parents, whether or not you spent time in developmental daycare, meaning a daycare that like was more skills and learning based. Um, and all of this just suggests that, middle class, upper middle class families are more likely to do these behaviors than uh, lower middle class or lower class families. And it's like, okay, well, why is this important? Well, we know that children that are in developmental daycare, they enter into kindergarten better prepared. Um, Eating dinner together as a family, spending time with your parents, not only does that just foster a closer relationship in family, but specifically for young children, it offers them the ability to engage in conversation and dialogue, which strengthens their verbal skills. And one of the more kind of controversial findings that come out of this research is, the word gap that exist in families where it's been suggested that children from higher income families comparative to lower income families, that in their early years they learn more words because their parents speak more to them and they speak a wider vocabulary from them, and they encourage them more as opposed to discouraging them by saying, no, don't do that. They offer explanations and just, and so the idea is, of course, that children, especially at a young age, their minds are like little sponges, and if you pour a lot in, they'll soak a lot up. But if you don't pour a lot in, then they're not going to soak up nearly as much. And that's been traditionally the concern. Although, it's worth mentioning that there are definitely people that have kind of pushed back about, this research. And I want you to read this article because I think it really calls into question, is it a word gap, or where we're really kind of focusing on the ways in which the lower class children are lacking vocabulary skills, or is it word wealth in the sense that it's more like upper class children have just this kind of wealth of words, or maybe does it even really matter what we call it if the result is that we know that some of these early childhood verbal skills seem to be closely related to uh, reading and other literacy skills, later in elementary and secondary years. But I like that article because it really does call into question some of the things that we perhaps have been assuming in research. Now, perhaps maybe one of the best known sociologists who's focused on the distinction in social class and parenting techniques is Annette Lareau. She had a book, Unequal Childhoods. It's a little dated now. Gosh, I can remember teaching it almost 2 decades ago, but it still stands out because she identified these two different parenting styles: concerted cultivation and the accomplishment of natural growth. And she related it to social class because it seemed like middle class parents were much more likely to use concerted cultivation. And she referred to them as treating their children like orchids, right? They spent just an inordinate amount of time, focusing on the child as an individual, trying to, uh, you know, determine what their talents and abilities and skills were and develop those. They filled their schedules with activities. They taught their children to engage directly with professional adults, like, hey, tell the doctor, how you've been feeling, as a way to try to communicate to them that they were entitled, and not in a bad way, but just kind of in a human way, that they were entitled to be treated a certain type of way and to develop kind of this sense of confidence, that they could go out in society and be assertive. Working class and poor parents, she found, were more likely to use the practice of the accomplishment of natural growth. And so they saw, they pretty much thought like, hey, I'm raising my child successfully as long as I am providing them with, protection, comfort, and care, like the basic necessities. And so they didn't overschedule their child with like music lessons and team sports and that type of thing. They kind of gave their child like, the ability to just play informally. um they were less assertive when interacting with authority figures like doctors and teachers, and they also, were less encouraging of their child being assertive to adults, both, with them, right? It was very much a do as I say, do as I say, not as I do, or do as I say, don't talk back. They didn't foster in their child this sense of entitlement. Instead, what she noted was they fostered in their child like this sense of constraint. And if the middle class kids were orchids, the working class poor kids were, she compared them to like cacti, where their parents just had a much more hands off kind of style of parenting. Doesn't mean they didn't love or care about them any less than the middle class parents. But what she really saw, of course, was it was really just a difference in values and perspective. And she noted that the concerted cultivation approach is, at that time was relatively new. you know it was people who had grown up during the baby boom generation, who had went to college, who had been exposed to some social science and learning development theories, and kind of kept their pulse on what do I need to do so that my child can have my same lifestyle. They can go to college, they can be middle upper middle class. So they were raising their kid in this new way because historically, before the 80s or 90s, pretty much accomplishment of natural growth had been what everyone was raising their child with, regardless of social class. And so although she emphasized that there are strengths and disadvantages to both approach, that societally we have gotten to the point where we pretty much reward the concerted cultivation approach to a much greater extent than the natural growth approach, which means that for the kids that come out of these households, once again, the middle class children are going to go into social settings and different contexts with this kind of privilege of having gained these experiences, of having been socialized in such a way that they have these skills that we in society tend to be more approving of. um Knowing how to assert yourself, knowing how to engage with other people, being very well informed about what your hobbies and talents and abilities are. We're at a point in society where we reward those a lot more than informal play and having close relations, with relationships with your cousins and extended family. And so you can kind of think about, what this has meant, in terms of the school system, because another one of her books and her research focuses on how these home advantages become school advantages, because schools led by teachers and administrators who, if they don't have middle class, upper middle class backgrounds, they at the very least have middle class, upper middle class lifestyles now. Once again, they reward, they appreciate, they look more favorably on this concerted cultivation approach and the children that are created through this approach than they perhaps do, on to the looking upon the children that grow up with the natural growth approach. And so what we see is that this home inequality seems to also be replicated in the school system, where a lot of the same social class disadvantages then are presented in the school system. And some of this, of course, is the greater likelihood that if you're from a poor household, you're going to go to a poor school. But we also see, even when you aren't going to a poor school, coming from a poor household seems to lead to you being more likely to have a negative experience and to not have the same educational outcomes as a middle class, upper class person in that same school. So in this way, social class, and it doesn't just play out in families, which is the primary focus of this chapter, and family is the focus of this course, but it also plays out in the educational system, which is why if you take a sociology of education class, you'll see a lot of these themes, and a lot of these theories pop up there as well. And so for your final reading, I want you to read this. Class differences in child rearing are on the rise. So this was written after the Laroe book comes out. So it's talking about additional research that's been done on this topic since then. And that is it for this chapter. Kind of a lengthy lecture. So kudos to sticking with it.